What does it mean to have spiritual strength in a world that wants you to be weak and dependent? Let's find out what some of the world's greatest spiritual traditions have to say about being spiritually strong. There have been many misunderstandings and misconceptions about Eastern philosophy and spirituality since it went west. And one is that Eastern philosophy and spirituality promotes a form of weakness and that someone should just yield to whatever the narrative is of the time and yield to others and so forth and so on. But nothing could be further from the truth. We need to rethink what we mean by being strong and also by what is weak. Because in the West, there's often a mentality that being strong is just being macho and pushing people over and getting your way, and being weak is one who just submits and so forth and so on. And so when we look at being spiritually strong, I often remember a quote by the Stoic philosopher Seneca, where Seneca said, "All cruelty springs from weakness." Now, what Seneca is saying here is that cruelty comes from people who are weak. Now, think about the world that we live in today, right? The constant narrative that people are being fed and the society that they find themselves in, particularly in places such as America, is making both men and women weak, right? There's certain slogans that people promote and undermine men, for example, and there are certain ideologies that underline women, particularly in America, and it makes people weak because people don't know how to deal with the situation, or they don't have a spine or a spiritual backbone. And as I have been alluding to, in Eastern spirituality and philosophy, being spiritually strong means you have a strong spine, right? You have a strong spine. You can deal with adversity in life. You can deal with challenges, and you have a heightened ability to deal with certain conflict and situations that you come across. Now, we live in a world today where the narrative and the mainstream media and the society you live in wants you not to be resolute in situations. They don't want you to have an ability to deal with situations. They want you to depend totally on them, right? They want you to depend on them in the way that they think, the way that they act, and so forth and so on. They don't want you to think independently, which I'll get to in a minute. But coming back to what Seneca was saying, Seneca is saying that actually violence and harm and everything like that comes from weak people, right? A weak person tends to be violent. Someone who has no strength, and I'm talking about inner strength here, tends to cause harm on others. And this is very interesting when we look at the world today, right? Because we see a lot of particularly young people who get violent, who cause a lot of chaos and trouble in certain parts of the world. But that's a sign of weakness and having no strength. And also the byproduct of a society and a narrative that is probably come from people with that same type of weakness, that they have no resolute attitude in how to deal with circumstances and how to deal with certain situations that are often tricky. And so they easily revert to violence and pushing their agenda on someone and so forth and so on. But what Seneca is saying here is that actually strength is having kindness, having humility, having compassion, and being non-violent. And this is an aspect of Eastern spirituality that we need to think about, right? When we think about ahimsa means non-violence, right? It means not having a violent thought. So in not having a violent thought, how could you produce violence out in the world? Being peaceful and compassionate and having kindness and empathy for others is actually a real strength. And that leads into, as I mentioned, compassion, karuna in Sanskrit, which is an important part of most of particularly the Indian spiritual traditions, where we have compassion for others and for all life, actually. And so that actually is a strength, not a weakness, right? So a lot of people in the West would probably think humility is humiliation, compassion is weakness, and so forth and so on. And this is the wrong mentality. And we're seeing that play out in the world, right? We're seeing weak people cause violence, try and force people to have a certain way of thinking, undermine men and women with their silly slogans and their silly ideologies. And for some reason, people believe it because they haven't built inner strength within themselves. In some sense, we've walked away from that inner strength, right? Because society undermines us that somehow strength is weakness and weakness is strength. And so if you buy into that, then you're bought into the whole crazy shenanigans that the mainstream media and that play day in, day out. So to back Seneca up here, we have to turn to the Tao Te Ching, right? Chapter 28 of the Tao Te Ching, where Lao Tzu states, "Know the strength of a man, but keep a woman's care." Now, you don't want to think about men and women here per se, because if we look at the traditional Chinese, we're talking about yang and yin, right? So we could translate that in some sense of knowing the yang, of knowing the strength, but keeping the yin. So embracing the yin as the core of our operating system, but conservatively using the yang, having that strength to deal with life when we come across certain situations or conflict and so forth and so on. But do you see here, when it says keep a woman's care or stick to the yin, we're talking about having that humility, that compassion, that empathy and kindness for others. That's what it's about, right? So you don't get easily pushed here and there by the changing tides of whatever the moral flavors of the time are, but you do keep to your center that yin aspect where you still have kindness and empathy for others, but you're not easily blown around because you have a spine, you have inner strength, right? And you're okay to say, no, I don't agree with that, and I'm just going to go this way, and I don't want to engage in what you are doing. I don't want to contribute or promote that at all because I have inner strength. I know right from wrong, so to speak, from a very naturalistic perspective, and so I'm just not going to do that, right? You need to remember that Lao Tzu himself was not a pushover, right? And this is another illusion that has gone to the West, where they think that people who follow Taoism, who are Taoist, and Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi themselves were just pushovers. Oh, they just yielded to whatever the narrative of the time was, and they just did this and that according to whatever the dictator said. And no, that's not the case, right? In the Warring States period of China, Confucius was trying to get people such as Lao Tzu and other Taoists to follow his system of thinking. And what did the Taoists do? They left society. They knew it was insane, because the idea that the Tao needs to be induced in the world is completely anti-Tao. When you think about it, right? Tao is ever present here and now. It could be nowhere else. It is fundamentally what nature is. It is the oneness of nature that's moving through all of us. And for some reason, Confucius has this strange idea that we need to induce this through a system that he created, a social system. And that's how we bring the Tao into the world. And Lao Tzu just said, no, that's not how we do it. We don't bind women's feet, as Confucianism promotes. We don't do these type of things. I don't need to sleep in a certain way to bring the Tao in my life. If I'm tired, I sleep, right? So Lao Tzu didn't fall for any BS, right? And he left the world because he had spiritual strength. And we too all have that spiritual strength as well. But we live in a world that is very divisive, and they have certain tricks and traps to make you weak, right? If you think a certain way, there's a trap there. If you have an idea, there's an ideology that says you're an idiot, and so forth and so on, right? This is the world they create to try and reduce all of us to the size of an ant, where we think we have no say and we think we are weak and spineless, so we just live in the world in a very weak way, where we think we have no power. But you have all the power that there is. You need to understand that the spiritual strength that I'm talking about is all within us. It's within all of us, right? But we need to understand the mechanics of yang and yin, as I've been mentioning, and how that emanates into the world. Even if we look at the yin and yang symbol, right? If we look at the yang, where it's all yang and then there's a little bit of yin, that's a direct reflection of how it is to be strong, right? That's got nothing to do with just being masculine. It's about being strong, not only mentally, but in some sense physically as well, about taking care of your health and well-being and taking care of your family and doing what's best for your immediate environment in a graceful manner, not in a way where you're pushing your agenda on everyone, but having that strength, right? Having what chapter 28 of the Tao Te Ching said, know the strength of man, but keep a woman's care, right? And that's for all of us. That's for each and every one of us. And so if you have that inner strength, as Lao Tzu had, and as obviously as Seneca had, then you won't fall for whatever the narratives are of the time. Now, mainstream media, particularly in the modern day, are constantly pushing idiotic ideologies onto people and very creepy moral flavors that they think people ought to follow. But we're seeing a little bit of pushback to this right now because people know, as Mencius said, we kind of know naturally what is right and wrong. We don't need to be told what it is. But it's almost like the mainstream media and the narratives of the modern day are just pushing people a little too far. But amazingly, there are certain groups of people who actually do follow this. And they've pushed innocent, decent people into a corner where people feel they have no strength, so they just follow these narratives, even though privately they think they're illogical. And so then people begin to depend on mainstream media and then begin to mimic its thinking, right? Now, you need to remember that mainstream media, mass media, is a relatively new phenomenon, right? This ability to push a certain narrative and ideologies down people's throat and telling people what the changing moral landscape is according to whatever they think is right, particularly people who live in Silicon Valley. So everyone begins then to copy just this one little tiny part of the world. Why don't we copy Bangladesh? Why don't we copy the morality of Bangladesh or Burkina Faso? Why do we copy the morality of Silicon Valley? And so then, because they have the ability to influence people through social media, because it is their product, you need to remember, it is their baby. And so then they begin to influence people. But as I mentioned, with social media, even with mainstream media, these are all relatively new. Not so long ago, only just over 100 years ago, a lot of the world still had independent thinking, right? We still thought independently. So we had what Mencius said. We didn't need to be told a lot of the time what was right and wrong. We just did what was naturally right in our immediate reality, our immediate community. And we didn't know what was going on the other side of the world, right? Unless you were very rich and you had access to a radio and you got subscription to the local newspaper and so forth and so on. But most people didn't, right? And so even if we go back 200 years, it was even less, right? So there was more independent thinking at that time. And so there was no influence from the outside. And so you had to navigate your immediate reality as you saw fit, right? And that's how it really is in nature. And we still have to do that. But then people who listen to too much social media or watch too much media have this background noise on loop. And they're trying to navigate reality, but they've got this looping background noise. And so then they engage reality more so with what's looping in their subconscious instead of just engaging with reality immediately and appropriately, because we don't lose that, but it gets rubbed out a little bit, right? When you begin to listen to too much of the media, social media, and so forth and so on. And the whole purpose of traditions like Taoism and Zen Buddhism is about making us natural again. And what does that mean? It means thinking independently, and in thinking independently, you encounter reality immediately and appropriately. That's the difference, right? You have immediacy, but you are also appropriate to each and every situation without having the moral narrative of the times playing in the back corner of your mind. And so in a nutshell, if you don't have that playing in your mind, you can approach reality as it is without being overly conditioned. People are so conditioned these days that they have so many things playing in their mind that they think that that's who they are, and it's not who they are. It's a version of what the mainstream media and the companies that fund them, what they want you to be. Imagine if you could just think independently. You could just think outside of the box. Right? You didn't fall for all of this divisive politics, and you didn't fall for politics in general, right? In Eastern spiritual and philosophical thinking, you have to get outside of political thinking. And that's very difficult for a lot of people to do, particularly in places such as America, where the mainstream media and social media and that has intentionally created a political atmosphere that keeps people at odds with each other. And if everyone realized that, they'd all stop playing the game and we'd all get along. You imagine? It seems like rocket science, but it's not. You've got to start to think for yourself. You've got to have spiritual strength, and you've got to do what is necessary to get there. Now, as I said, some ideas to get there is to turn the TV off. Don't scroll social media. Just simple things, right? To reclaim your sanity, but also being physically healthy too, right? A lot of the times, the social narrative is constantly trying to make you unhealthy, right? They say you need to depend on big pharma and all of these things. You need this. You can't be healthy without us, right? All of these overarching institutions, but that is bogus. We've lived on this planet most of our existence without any of that. So taking care of your health, exercise, simple things to gain a sense of confidence and strength back, that you don't need to depend on these overarching systems. And so in the end, if you choose to take that road, you can be brave, courageous, and in the end spiritually strong to follow your own path without having society or culture tell you what is right and wrong. You can follow your own path, and nothing is more dangerous than that, right? That's what Lao Tzu represented. He represented a rebel to the world, and he wasn't the only one. If we go all throughout the spiritual lineages of the East, we find many individuals who just went counter to whatever the society and culture was doing at the time. If we look at India, you look at the great siddhas, if you look at the great yogis and sadhus, they all left the world because they knew that that wasn't a sane place for people to reside for far too long, right? This is why in the yogic tradition, actually, a yogi can't stay in a certain location for too long because they pick up the habits and the tendencies of that particular place. And that doesn't keep your mind free and liberated. And look, you don't want to encounter that with any sort of fear, but it's just a type of maintenance for a yogi, right? It's just a way of keeping the mind open and free instead of bringing in all of these social and cultural ideas that begin to solidify the jiva, that persona system, that ego that you think you are, but you're not. And it's in realizing that you're not that you can then access more kindness, humility, compassion, innocence, and you can bring that into the world. And so when the world needs you, you can stand up and say, no, we're not going to do that. But you can also then have compassion and empathy for the world and others, no matter what the situation is, right? So you have both yin and yang solid in your being, where you are not blown here or there. You are like that strong grandfather, right? That strong grandfather who on the exterior may seem strong, but very soft underneath, right? Very soft and caring for others, and almost like a leader in the society. That's what we all truly are. We are all leaders in the world, but we all get confused with the social and cultural narratives of the time. And those narratives are trying to reduce you to a weak, spineless person, and they want you to believe that. But the truth is that you are spiritually strong, and your nature is a mighty being. And that's what they fear the most. They fear that mighty being coming alive and not being pushed around by the social and cultural narratives and view of the world that don't have essentially anything to do with you and I. And the reason it doesn't have anything to do with you and I is because it's their version of the world that they're trying to push on you, because they are under the assumption that you are weak. But the reality is that you're a mighty being. And all you need is to stand up and to embrace both yin and yang. And that is the greatest fear that any government, any overarching media, any overarching institution fears the most. Shanti, shanti, shanti.